28th lesson looks at the underlying problems with the American economy and the crash. A little bit of this is going to be review off the start to set up for why the Wall Street crash happened. I'm going to run you through a number of factor-based reasons for the crash, which will set you up quite nicely for future essay questions. You're welcome. Okay, so let's start with the first one here. The Roaring Twenties. It should be important, and you probably should realize right now that the Roaring Twenties doesn't exemplify all of America. It's really a tale of two Americas. Of course, we earned the moniker the Roaring Twenties through its sort of real and sustained technological advances. It's extremely lively culture, both in white culture and, of course, in black culture with the Harlem Renaissance. Also, you get the flourishing of mass production, mass consumption, way too much overproduction. And in some cases, people got fantastically wealthy, even more so than they had in the Gilded Age. And that wealth was probably spread around to a little bit of a greater degree, though at the top end of society, the stupendous wealth they had certainly outweighed the bottom end. I think what the important thing to remember is something to the degree of 0.1% of the population had 40% of the nation's wealth. But on the contrary, for a large minority of Americans who made their livelihoods predominantly in agriculture, the decade didn't necessarily roar. It was pretty depressing, and the tale of farmers in the 1920s is one of prolonged agricultural depression leading into the 1930s, which is prolonged agricultural incredible depression. So it's really just going from, let's just say, the frying pan to the fire. Okay, so what else do we have to consider? The other major aspect here is labor militancy, recession, and recovery. What you should note is that the 1920s also isn't a period of complete sustained economic growth. Actually, when it comes in 1920, the American economy is doing really badly. It had transitioned poorly back to peacetime after the First World War. Labor unions had grown very strong during the war, and there's a number of strikes. In fact, that's not just in America, but that's a worldwide thing. 1919 is oftentimes known as the year of the strike. The largest strike, there was this general strike of all workers in the city of Seattle, literally shutting the city down. The entire American steel industry goes on strike. But what's probably more concerning is that, though they do get some concessions, it started to worry a lot of Americans. And what you see, of course, as a consequence of this is labor unions not necessarily being successful thereafter, because the overwhelming wave of sentiment was against the striking workers. The employers will hold firm. Most of the strikes will collapse. There will be some concessions gained, but not that much. During 1920, for instance, in 1921, unemployment actually goes up to 11%. One of the heroes in this whole situation, and it's really important to consider this when we weigh up the man, is Herbert Hoover. Okay? He's the Commerce Secretary at this particular point. And in 1920, he convinces many industrial leaders to voluntarily increase wages, therefore avoiding trade unions from taking over their factories. And what he's able to do by increasing wages is it increases spending, and this pulls the economy out of the slump. This is actually something he'll try in 1929, but the scale of the disaster in 1929 far exceeds anything from the post-World War I era. He actually gets a very well-deserved reputation as a man who can work with both sides. And in large part, his humongous personal popularity is responsible for his election win in 1928. And of course, it is Herbert Hoover who will have to wear the depression, but in essence, maybe it's not his fault. So let's just start looking and thinking big when we consider these topics. Well, one more point, and I sort of alluded to it a second ago, is you have to remember, too, that the FBI cracks down pretty harshly on any radicals. People like Eugene Debs, who led a lot of these strikes, was thrown in jail for a period of time. And what we see again is government in the start of the 1920s making it safe for big business. And after this sort of recession turns around, many thanks to Hoover, things start to take off. And it's a great time to be rich. In fact, Andrew Mellon, as we've discussed before, the Treasury Secretary, rewards himself and a whole cadre of his really elitist friends by dropping income tax for the wealthiest from 73% of their personal earnings to just 25%. And as a result, investors enjoy one of the largest bull markets in American history. A bull market is a market that continuously grows. Meanwhile, what we see is the explosion in mass production. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is a measure, a statistical measure of the country's production and growth in its industrial economy, sees its value increase more than 6 times the high of 1961. Um, However, it's really also important to know, and one of the things a lot of people say is, well, of course, the stock market crash was caused by the fact that all Americans owned stocks, and then these stocks were valueless, and all Americans lost their money. That's probably wrong. That is wrong, in effect. 1% of Americans own stock. Okay, so the fabulous returns and also the fabulous falls of the 1930s are in large part due affecting a small minority of people. So what we see again is in the 1920s, those people who own stock and invest in the stock market do fabulously well. However, those that don't invest don't enjoy in that success, but they don't get hurt by the fall. They get hurt by a whole bunch of other stuff in pretty spectacular ways. Anyways, what we see the Roaring Twenties is a classic case of the rich getting richer. Actually, the rich getting much, 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 much richer. It's also a pretty decent time to be middle class. This is really the time of the emerging, growing middle class. Urban workers' wages raise about 20% in the 1920s. The falling cost of new mass-produced goods, competition in the marketplace means that they can even stretch these wages further. For instance, Ford's Model T car, the most popular car in America, cost almost $1,000 when it was first produced in 1908. By the 1920s, okay, it costs less than $300. Ford also sells about 15 million Model Ts during the 1920s, and automobile ownership increases dramatically for one car per 15 Americans before the 1920s to 1 in 5. Most of the things that these people enjoyed would have been impossible for people only a decade earlier to have. Therefore, the 1920s were a pretty good time to be middle class as well. To reiterate what I said, rural America, of course, is left behind by modernity. I'm not going to go beat on this too much more, but what we have to remember is that at the end of the war, American farmers who had done very well during the war, because the war was fought across European farmland predominantly, and these farmers couldn't work their land, evidently. But when the war ends, these farmers go back to their land and start farming again. European production of grain and things resumes, and there's suddenly not the need for American agricultural products. And with no market to buyers, for buyers of these, the American economy suffers pretty dramatically. So what we see from 1920 to 1921 is the prices farmers can get fall at a pretty catastrophic rate. Cotton falls dramatically. That's actually a consequence of the production of new materials like synthetic ones like rayon. Not actually to mention the fact that the Roaring Twenties and the fact that women wore less material in terms of skirts, and they wore shirts with no sleeves and things like that actually reduced the overall need for cotton, the primary thread or the primary material from which clothes are made. Wheat production falls by half is another example. Rural America's fall means effectively falls behind in overall wealth. Electrification, necessary to provide power into people's homes and so on and so forth, falls behind. By the end of the decade, 90% of American farms are still without electricity. It's probably no great exaggeration to say that rural America, the Great Depression actually began not in 29, but somewhere around 1920. And it will continue for an entire generation. You generally look at a generation being a period of about 15 to 20 years. So what we see, the 1920, yep, pretty good for urban America, predominantly the rich and the middle class. Horrendous, 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 horrendous for American farmers. What this all leads to is the crash, the Great Crash, and you have to be able to understand that there's got to separate the crash from the depression. The crash is what happens as a consequence of Wall Street dropping huge amounts, something like $6 billion in its value, in one day or in a period of a couple days, known as Black Thursday in October 1929. The Great Crash only affected a tiny minority of affluent Americans who owned stock at the time. However, as a consequence of the pinch on their wealth, the cutbacks they make to the factories and the industries that they own cause a nationwide economic downturn, which is unprecedented in its depth and length. And that's what makes the Great Depression more different and worse than any of the other depressions that came after it or before it, is the duration of it. It was biting and it went on for a very, very long time. And the descent from how high things were in the 1920s to the Great Depression makes the Great Depression feel and seem even worse. Okay, the juxtaposition between where we were and where we are was tremendously, tremendously steep. So let's account for the Wall Street crash. Okay, what we see is that in the Wall Street crash, the short-term consequences, we get 16 million shares change hands within a few weeks, and 30 billion had been lost by the end of October 1929. It starts off with a one-day drop of 6 billion, then goes to 30 billion in a matter of a few weeks. So let's account for the Wall Street crash. The first one is, why did it happen? The first reason is the loss of confidence. Okay, the historian named Clement says the Wall Street crash was Wall Street was a market structure maintained largely by the confidence people had in it. Okay, if people believe that that money is going to be there, they will continue to invest in it. What happens in October 1929 is people lose confidence in the Wall Street crash almost immediately. There's a really interesting link in Britain. They say that the Wall Street crash began in Britain because in Britain the loss of confidence begins a little bit early. A guy named Clarence Hattery, he had a huge financial empire stretching numerous banks, both in Britain and internationally within the British Empire, was issuing fraudulent stock. Anyways, make a long story short, this man goes to jail. Investors in the USA look at concern of some of the practices within their own country and the businesses in which they had stock, and they see many, many similarities between what Hattery had done and what potentially people were doing in the United States. And as a consequence of this, without actually finding real corruption, rumors start to spread that perhaps the stock market was based on fraudulent investment. And as a consequence, big stock market players such as Bernard Baruch start selling their stocks. And what happens as they start to sell their stocks is another rumor starts that the Federal Reserve Board was about to tighten credit facilities. In other words, lending was going to be decreased and perhaps interest rates would go up. People who had borrowed too much when loans were recalled were unable to pay them once the stock exchange crashed in 1929. Lenders began to call in credit, then you get more panic, loss of confidence, and then you get the crash. It's really has its origins in rumor in a lot of ways. Secondly, the nature of the bull market. Between 1927 and 1929, the stock market earned the name the Great Bull Market. There was an idea in America that the stock market would continuously go up and up and up, that it was charging forward. Hence, if you go to Wall Street today, you'll see a big bronze bull outside the stock exchange in Wall Street. It's quite famous. There's a whole bunch of tourists taking pictures with it all the time, kids trying to climb on top of it. But it was put up there to remind Americans how great and powerful the economy was. And it stands there sort of as this interesting monument to the bull market of the 1920s, but also a reminder of how poorly things can go. The structure and practices that went on in Wall Street contain the seeds of its own collapse. What you get really fundamentally is something known as buying on the margin. Okay, 50,000 people will buy shares for a fraction. Okay, with bank loans paying for the rest, which means that people are investing not their own money, but money that they mostly borrow. Okay, and this works very well if share prices rise, because then you can pay off the interest on your loans, and then you can pay off the debt from which you borrowed, as long as those share prices get to go up. And this worked very, very well throughout the 1920s for a lot of people who borrowed money to invest in the stock market. But this works only if the share prices go up. Okay. The other thing was known as bull pooling. Okay, what happens is people artificially inflate the price of shares by buying and selling shares to each other. And therefore, people see that these shares are trading very heavily and think, well, that must be a really good thing to invest in. But what happens is you may have 100 or 150 people buying and selling shares to each other to show that that share is really valuable, increasing incentive for other people to buy, thus driving the share price up. Okay. When that happens, or when people start to lose confidence, they start to sell off things, and this causes the price to fall. And this leaves the outsiders, the people who weren't bull pooling, with a depreciated stock that they bought probably too high because the bull poolers were driving the price of that stock up. There's a total disregard for the market. Okay, everybody is in this small group of 1% is doing what's known as insider dealing and manipulating the market to their own end. They're getting fabulously rich in the short term, but they're also creating a position where they're going to lose massively. And others who buy into it, perhaps who aren't as knowledgeable of what's going on the inside, lose out massively. Okay, this is probably, though, and I'm going to argue this, not as significant as the loss of confidence. The bull market had really been around since World War I, though it tends to be exemplified by what happened between 27 and 1929. And there had never necessarily been a crash of this magnitude. So while this contributes to why the crash occurred, I wouldn't argue it isn't necessarily a pivotal factor. Okay, now here's the next one. Government policy. There was, as you know, a lack of regulation. Okay, Hoover's Republicans were pushing laissez-faire. Coolidge's Republicans were pushing laissez-faire, as were Warren G. Harding's. The Federal Reserve Board, formed of private bankers who put their financial concerns above the national interest. This really began to happen with Harding, and I've mentioned this in a few times, is that the people who are supposed to regulate the economy are the people who are benefiting the economy. Therefore, they don't necessarily regulate it at all or very well. Okay, the only real power was controlling what's known as the rediscount rate. Here's an example. From spring 1927, the bull market was fueled by cutting the interest rate from 4% to 3%, which means that people can borrow more to invest in stocks. Okay. Finally, in August 1929, they increased it to 6% to deter borrowing, because it starts to get out of control, and calm the stock market down. But it wasn't enough. People keep investing and investing and investing. And when so many people are leveraged to get into the stock market, okay, they're effectively going to create that loss in confidence. The government regulating system, because they can only really set the interest rate higher or lower, okay, is effectively powerless to fix it. So, sorry about the glitch there. Why this is an important reason. Number one, if better regulation existed, the nature of the bull market could have been tempered, okay? And the market gets out of control, okay? It makes it more important than the previous point that I just made. But it's also important to note that Wall Street hadn't been regulated much before, okay, since its inception, and yet it never crashed like it had before. So whereas this is a huge loss of confidence, okay, which is probably what triggers the crash, okay, the government regulation, okay, had been there, or deregulation, if you will, had been there since the start. The next point we're going to look at is how important was the crash as a cause of the Depression. Okay, and this is actually a very important overall factor. But one of the other things we have to consider is the Depression and the crash are two distinct things. And we looked at why the stock market fell apart, affecting a small minority of Americans, but then having the knock-on effects. We're now going to look at how the crash leads into a prolonged depression, where the American economy recedes year on year on year on year. Okay, and what we have to remember is that the crash is an important trigger in worsening the Great Depression. Now, here's one reason. Number one, it collapsed business. So much of the prosperity in the 1920s was on the continuing demand for consumer durables or consumer products. Okay. However, since so many people lost money in the crash, okay, the people and businesses could not afford to buy the mass-produced goods that were being sold. You get $30 billion lost, and that's a huge amount of money. The Rockefellers, some of the richest people in the world, lost $50 million themselves. Okay, so industries suffer from a lack of demand. When people are losing money, they buy less. It's just as simple as that. This will have knock-on effects, because when people buy less, you need less workers to produce it. This creates unemployment, and this also leads to both personal and industrial bankruptcies. Here are some effects. In June 32, the New York Stock Exchange closed at 58.46. It had stood at 164 as its measure in November 1929, less than a month after the Wall Street crash. Stock markets had crashed before, with ensuing economic depressions. American business, in many ways, though, was too diversified to be influenced to a significant extent by the stock market. So in many ways, perhaps this isn't the biggest cause. One of the other issues, and this is a pretty important one in lengthening the depression. If you study the 2008 depression and you study the responses of the bankers to the 2008 depression, you learn that one of the things that the lesson of the Great Depression in many ways that was avoided in 2008, excuse me, is the fact that they continued to give credit. They needed to keep people's ability to borrow flourishing as a result of what happened in the 1920s. So let me explain. The 1920s, as you well know, was in many ways the buying and buying and buying had to do with people buying consumer goods on credit. 75% of cars sold in the United States were bought on credit, for example. The banks were affected by the crash. They lost these investments. People couldn't, the banks rather, lost huge amounts of money that they had invested. And therefore, as a result of losing this money, they were reticent to make further loans. The Federal Reserve, made things worse by raising interest rates. Okay, and they do this to maintain the US's supply of gold when it should have reduced the rates. And I'll explain that to you guys in further detail in class. But if you want to look it up, look at the gold standard in the Great Depression, put it on Wikipedia. There's about a paragraph there that will explain it very, very clearly. The credit squeeze, okay? As a result of all of this, the banks stop lending. It becomes very difficult for people to get credit. Okay. Not only that, banks start recalling some of their loans. And this lengthens the depression massively. Companies that start to improve themselves during the Great Depression are maybe willing to make that next step and hire more, cannot borrow the necessary income to reinvest in or the necessary money to reinvest in their companies. And as fortunes, as I say, begin to stabilize in 1931, 1932, as sort of the worst of the crash and the depression seems to settle in, it prevents people from being able to borrow, and the economy can't get restarted. And the depression drags on and on and on into the 1930s. Another major issue was government economic policies. Okay, the crash, it's important to remember, was not bound to lead to the depression. President Hoover doesn't do necessarily a lot beyond appealing to bosses not to lay off the workers. He really tries his tactics in the 1920s. And again, we're going to talk about this stuff in greater detail. But Hoover believed that the crash was a necessary correction. A lot of people at the top of business thought, well, yes, the bull market was too hot. This will fix it. There'll be a market readjustment. People will suffer for a little bit, but then everything will go back to normal and we'll have learned our lessons and the American economy will tick right on. They thought about the panics of the 1890s. They thought about the panics of the early 20th century, and they said, well, these panics lasted maybe a quarter, maybe 2 quarters. Everything will get better. And as a result, basically, the individualism of and the sort of the go-to of the American individual will help pull us out. However, what they don't really, I guess, rationalize at the time, and it's sort of difficult to blame them, but it's also easy to blame them. That's a contradiction. Anyways, if you think about it, they had no precedent for this. That's why it's difficult not to blame them, but it's easy to blame them because they should have looked and said this is really, really bad and done more about it. Effectively, the government has a philosophical objection to intervention, and this helps create the crisis and make it worse. As a consequence, he did little to really stop the spread of the problem, only making it worse in the long term. The other issue of why the crash leads to the depression, and this is the final slide for today, is it collapses confidence in the American system. Remember again that only a few really trade stocks and shares, but historian Galbraith argues that it had become a typical American institution. People ignored the warning voices that had been reassured by the White House and big business that everything would be fine. When the crash hits, people are no longer willing to listen to the voices who said everything is fine in the 1920s, and they lose confidence overall in those that govern and regulate the economy. The credibility of the American system and the capitalist system was severely undermined. And one of the things you'll have to consider is how much the American system was saved. People get positively revolutionary in the 1930s during the Great Depression about changing the system entirely because there's so much of a loss of confidence, and that underlines huge left-wing movements such as the ones led by Huey Long, things we'll talk about a little bit later on. These people, it was largely believed, had let the nation down. Okay? The lack of regulation was fine, they said, but it really wasn't. This caused a further drop in demand, drew people's attention to the poor performing sectors of the US economy, and people just held on to their money because they believed that even if the depression lessened, the system was fundamentally broken. However, it's also important to remember that the crash is a financial issue. Okay? The depression was due to structural problems in the economy. You have inequality, a fall in the construction industry, the banking system in Wall Street, laissez-faire, get-rich-quick schemes, and international economic issues. So, in many ways, the crash had effects in making the depression happen. But was it the primary cause? No, it's probably structural. That said, that is how, and those four reasons are how the crash made the depression worse.